The black limousine rolled through the massive iron gates of Buckingham Palace, its engine purring quietly against the backdrop of centuries-old stone walls. Inside, Donald Trump adjusted his red tie one final time and peered through the bulletproof window at the sprawling courtyard ahead. This wasn't just any ordinary day. This was his first official state visit to Britain as President of the United States. The car came to a smooth stop on the perfectly manicured gravel driveway. Trump could see the elaborate preparations that had been made for his arrival. Red carpets stretched across the courtyard like rivers of velvet. British flags hung alongside American ones, creating a sea of red, white, and blue that caught the afternoon sunlight. The smell of fresh flowers drifted through the air, mixed with the faint scent of history that seemed to cling to every corner of the palace grounds. As Trump stepped out of the limousine, his polished black shoes crunched softly on the gravel. The sound echoed off the palace walls, creating a rhythm that seemed to announce his presence to the world. He straightened his shoulders and took in the full scope of what lay before him. This was power on display. Not just American power, but the kind of ancient, deep-rooted authority that had shaped empires and changed the course of history. The first thing that caught his attention was the sheer size of everything. The palace itself seemed to stretch endlessly in both directions, its windows glinting like eyes watching his every move. Towering columns supported balconies where he could imagine royalty once stood to address their subjects. Every detail, from the intricate stonework to the perfectly maintained gardens visible in the distance, spoke of wealth and influence that had been passed down through generations. But it wasn't the building that truly captured Trump's focus. It was the guards. They stood like living statues throughout the courtyard, each one positioned with mathematical precision. Their red uniforms blazed against the pale stone of the palace, and their famous black bearskin hats added an extra foot to their already impressive height. These weren't just any soldiers. These were the Queen's Guard, the legendary protectors of the British monarchy whose image had been printed on postcards and tourist souvenirs around the world. Trump had seen pictures of them before, of course. Every American who had ever visited London came back with stories about the guards who never moved, never smiled, never broke character no matter what tourists did to try to get their attention. But seeing them in person was different. There was something almost supernatural about their stillness, as if they had been carved from stone rather than born of flesh and blood. As he walked across the courtyard, Trump's own entourage fell into step behind him. Secret Service agents moved with practiced efficiency, their eyes scanning every corner for potential threats. American diplomats clutched their briefcases and tried to look appropriately dignified for the historic occasion. Camera crews captured every step, knowing that this footage would be replayed on news channels around the world. The president felt the familiar surge of confidence that came with being the center of attention. This was his element, the grand stage, the watching eyes, the weight of important decisions hanging in the air. Back home, when he entered a room, conversations stopped. Military officers snapped to attention. Senators and congressmen rose from their seats. The power of his office preceded him everywhere he went, opening doors and commanding respect. Here at Buckingham Palace, surrounded by all the pageantry and tradition of the British monarchy, Trump felt that same sense of authority flowing through him. After all, he was the President of the United States, leader of the free world, commander-in-chief of the most powerful military on earth. Surely that meant something, even here in this ancient place where kings and queens had ruled for 1,000 years. The guards continued their silent vigil as the presidential party made its way toward the palace entrance. Trump found himself studying them more closely with each step. Their faces were hidden partially by the shadow of their enormous hats, but he could see the discipline in their posture, the years of training that had taught them to stand perfectly still for hours at a time. Their rifles were held at exactly the same angle, their boots polished to a mirror shine that reflected the palace walls. One guard in particular drew Trump's attention. He was positioned near the main entrance, close enough that Trump would have to walk directly past him. The soldier was young, probably in his 20s, with the kind of rigid posture that only came from military training. His eyes stared straight ahead, focused on some invisible point in the distance. completely ignoring the approaching American delegation. Trump slowed his pace slightly, his businessman's instincts kicking in. Throughout his life, he had learned to read people, to understand the dynamics of power and respect in any situation. In boardrooms and political meetings, he knew how to establish dominance, how to make sure everyone understood who was in charge. The key was confidence, projection, making it clear that you expected to be obeyed. As he drew closer to the guard, Trump felt the eyes of the world upon him. Cameras were recording every moment, journalists were taking notes, and diplomats from both countries were watching to see how this historic meeting would unfold. This was more than just a ceremonial visit. It was a test of leadership, a chance to show that American authority was respected even in the most traditional corners of the old world. The guard remained motionless as Trump approached, giving no sign that he had even noticed the most powerful man in America walking toward him. To Trump, this seemed like an oversight, a breach of the protocol that usually surrounded his appearances. Everywhere he went, people acknowledged his presence. Military personnel saluted, civilians nodded respectfully, and world leaders extended their hands in greeting. It was simply the natural order of things when you held the highest office in the land. But this British soldier continued to stare straight ahead, as unmoved by Trump's approach, as if the president were just another tourist passing by. The moment stretched on, creating a tension that seemed to fill the entire courtyard. Something had to give. Someone had to acknowledge the obvious hierarchy at play here. Trump's mind raced through the possibilities. Maybe the guard hadn't seen him yet. Maybe he was waiting for some kind of signal. Or maybe he simply needed a reminder of who he was dealing with. After all, respect wasn't always automatic. Sometimes it had to be demanded, commanded, insisted upon. That was just the nature of leadership. The president stopped walking and stood directly in front of the guard, close enough to see the individual threads in the soldier's red uniform. The moment had arrived. It was time to establish the proper order of things to make sure everyone understood exactly who was in charge of this situation. Trump stood there for what felt like an eternity, waiting for some kind of acknowledgement from the guard. The silence stretched between them like a rubber band ready to snap. Back home, this would never happen. When the President of the United States walked into a room, everyone knew it. Military personnel would straighten up, civilians would turn their heads, and conversations would pause out of respect for the office. But this British soldier continued staring straight ahead as if Trump were invisible. His eyes never wavered, never blinked, never showed even the slightest hint that he recognized the most powerful man in the world, standing just 3 feet away from him. The guard's face remained as expressionless as carved marble, giving away nothing about what he might be thinking or feeling. Trump felt a familiar heat rising in his chest. This wasn't just unusual, it was downright disrespectful. Throughout his entire presidency, he had grown accustomed to a certain level of protocol. When he visited military bases, soldiers would snap to attention the moment he appeared. When he walked through the halls of Congress, senators would nod respectfully. Even foreign leaders, despite their political differences, would acknowledge his presence with appropriate ceremony. The president shifted his weight from one foot to the other, his expensive leather shoes scraping slightly against the gravel. The sound seemed loud in the quiet courtyard, but still the guard didn't react. Trump could feel the eyes of his own staff watching from behind him, probably wondering why he had stopped walking. Camera crews were still rolling, capturing every second of what was supposed to be a smooth, dignified arrival. Maybe the guard simply hadn't noticed him yet. After all, these soldiers were famous for their intense focus and discipline. Trump had heard stories about tourists trying everything they could think of to get a reaction from the Queen's Guard, making faces, telling jokes, even dancing right in front of them. But the guards never broke character, never acknowledged the attempts to distract them from their duty. Still, this was different. Trump wasn't some random tourist looking for a funny photo. He was the President of the United States, here on official business, invited by the British government itself. Surely that changed things. Surely there was some level of respect and recognition that transcended even the strictest military protocols. The president cleared his throat, a sound that in the Oval Office would immediately draw the attention of everyone present. But the guard remained frozen in place, his rifle held at the exact same angle it had been for the past hour, his eyes fixed on that same invisible point somewhere beyond Trump's shoulder. Trump took a small step closer, now close enough to see the individual stitches in the guard's red tunic, close enough to notice the way the afternoon sunlight reflected off the polished buttons that ran down the front of his uniform. The soldier was young, probably not much older than Trump's own sons, with the kind of pale complexion that suggested he spent most of his time indoors or under the shadow of that enormous bearskin hat. The president studied the guard's face more carefully, looking for any sign of awareness, any tiny muscle twitch or eye movement that might indicate he was being deliberately ignored rather than simply following orders. But there was nothing. The soldier's expression remained completely blank, as if he had mastered the art of turning himself into a living statue. Behind Trump, he could hear the quiet murmur of his staff beginning to whisper among themselves. American diplomats were checking their watches and glancing toward the palace entrance, clearly eager to move on to the next phase of the visit. Secret Service agents maintained their professional composure, but Trump could sense their slight discomfort with how long this impromptu stop was taking. British officials, meanwhile, stood at a respectful distance, their faces carefully neutral as they watched the scene unfold. They had probably witnessed similar situations before, foreign dignitaries encountering the Queen's Guard for the first time and not quite understanding how the system worked. But none of them stepped forward to explain or intervene. They simply waited, letting the moment play out according to whatever script Trump was writing in his head. The president felt his patience beginning to wear thin. This wasn't how things were supposed to go. State visits followed certain patterns, certain expectations. There were protocols to be observed, hierarchies to be respected, and proper ways for military personnel to acknowledge their superiors. Even if this soldier served a different country, surely he understood the basic principles of military courtesy. Trump's mind flashed back to countless similar situations throughout his presidency. He remembered visiting aircraft carriers where thousands of sailors would line the deck, all standing at attention as he walked past. He thought about ceremonies at Arlington National Cemetery, where honor guards would execute their movements, with precision choreography, every step calculated to show proper respect for the commander-in-chief. Those moments had always filled him with a sense of pride and authority. They reminded him of the weight his office carried, the responsibility and power that came with being elected by millions of Americans to lead their country. When military personnel saluted him, they weren't just acknowledging Donald Trump, the person. They were showing respect for the entire democratic process that had put him in that position. But here, standing in front of this British Guard, Trump felt none of that familiar validation. Instead, he experienced something he wasn't used to, being completely ignored by someone in uniform. It was as if his presence, his office, his entire identity as leader of the free world meant absolutely nothing to this young soldier. The president's jaw tightened slightly as he made a decision. Sometimes leadership required taking charge of situations that weren't going according to plan. Sometimes you had to be direct, clear, and unmistakable in your expectations. If this guard needed a reminder of who he was dealing with, then Trump was prepared to provide that reminder. He straightened his shoulders and drew himself up to his full height, assuming the authoritative posture that had served him well in boardrooms, on television stages, and in political negotiations around the world. His voice, when he finally spoke, carried all the confidence and command that had helped him win the presidency and navigate the complexities of international diplomacy. The words came out clear and strong, cutting through the quiet afternoon air like a knife through silk. They were simple words, the kind of direct instruction that any military person should understand immediately. Trump spoke with the absolute certainty of someone who had never doubted his right to be obeyed, someone who had spent years having his commands followed without question. But even as the words left his mouth, something in the back of his mind wondered if he was making the right choice. There was something about this place, something about the weight of all that history and tradition surrounding him, that suggested the normal rules might not apply here. Still, He had committed himself now. The command had been given, and all that remained was to see how this British soldier would respond to a direct order from the President of the United States. "Soldier, salute," Trump said, his voice carrying across the courtyard with the kind of authority that had commanded boardrooms and political rallies for decades. The words hung in the air like smoke from a fired gun. For a moment, the entire world seemed to pause. Birds stopped chirping in the nearby trees. The gentle breeze that had been rustling through the palace gardens fell still. Even the distant sounds of London traffic seemed to fade away, leaving nothing but the echo of Trump's command bouncing off the ancient stone walls. But the guard didn't move, not even a twitch. Trump blinked, certain he had misunderstood what just happened. Surely the soldier had heard him. The command had been clear, direct, and impossible to misinterpret. "Soldier, salute." 3 simple words that any military person in the world should understand immediately. Yet the guard continued to stand there like a statue carved from flesh and bone, his eyes still fixed on that mysterious point somewhere beyond Trump's shoulder. The president felt a strange sensation creeping up his spine. It was unfamiliar and uncomfortable, the feeling of giving an order and having it completely ignored. Throughout his entire life, from his days in business to his years in the White House, Trump had grown accustomed to people responding when he spoke. Employees jumped into action, advisors took notes, reporters leaned forward to catch every word. His voice carried weight, commanded attention, demanded results. But this British soldier remained as motionless as the palace walls behind him. Trump's eyes narrowed as he studied the guard more carefully. The young man's face showed absolutely no expression whatsoever. His lips were pressed together in a straight line. His cheeks were pale but steady, showing no sign of strain or emotion. Even his breathing seemed controlled and measured, as if he had trained himself to become a living, breathing piece of furniture. The president took another step closer, now so near to the guard that he could smell the wool of his red uniform and see the individual hairs of his carefully groomed eyebrows. At this distance, it would be impossible for the soldier not to hear every word. Impossible to pretend he hadn't received a direct command from the most powerful person in the free world. "I said salute," Trump repeated, his voice a little louder, this time with an edge that suggested his patience was running thin. Still nothing. The guard's rifle remained positioned at exactly the same angle. His shoulders stayed perfectly square. His feet stayed planted in the same spot they had occupied for the past hour. It was as if Trump's words were simply bouncing off an invisible shield that surrounded the soldier, deflecting them harmlessly into the afternoon air. Behind Trump, the atmosphere was beginning to change. He could sense his staff starting to shift uncomfortably, feel their eyes darting between him and the unresponsive guard. The smooth, choreographed nature of the state visit was beginning to develop its first real hiccup, and everyone could feel it. American diplomats were exchanging subtle glances, the kind of silent communication that happened when experienced professionals realized a situation was veering off script. They had prepared for months for this visit, studying British protocols, rehearsing proper procedures, making sure every detail would go smoothly. But nobody had prepared them for their president to get into a staring contest with one of the Queen's Guards. Secret Service agents maintained their professional composure, but Trump could sense their heightened alertness. They were trained to spot potential problems before they became real issues, and a standoff between the president and a foreign soldier, no matter how ceremonial, was definitely worth monitoring. Their hands didn't move toward their weapons, but their eyes became more focused, their stance more ready. The British officials, meanwhile, seemed to be holding their breath. Trump caught glimpses of them in his peripheral vision, standing at their respectful distance like referees at a boxing match, waiting to see who would blink first. Their faces remained diplomatically neutral, but he could almost feel their collective tension rising with each passing second. Camera crews continued rolling, of course. This was supposed to be routine footage of a presidential arrival, the kind of standard ceremonial material that would probably end up as background shots on the evening news. But now they were capturing something entirely different, a moment of genuine confusion and growing frustration that could potentially become an international incident. Trump felt heat rising in his chest again, the familiar burn of anger that came when people didn't show him the respect he believed he deserved. This wasn't just about military protocol anymore. This was about recognition, authority, and the basic courtesies that should exist between civilized nations. He was the President of the United States, for crying out loud. He commanded the most powerful military in human history. He made decisions that affected billions of people around the globe, and this British soldier was treating him like he was invisible. The president's business instincts kicked in, the same mental processes that had helped him navigate complex negotiations and hostile takeovers throughout his career. When someone wasn't responding to direct communication, you had to escalate. You had to make your position crystal clear. You had to establish dominance before the other party started thinking they could walk all over you. Trump straightened his tie and adjusted his posture, preparing to try a different approach. Maybe the guard hadn't understood that this was a direct order rather than a suggestion. Maybe he needed to hear the command delivered with even more authority, more clarity, more unmistakable presidential power. But even as he prepared to speak again, something strange began to happen. For the first time since this bizarre standoff had begun, Trump started to notice details he had missed before. The guard's uniform wasn't just red. It was a specific shade of scarlet that had probably been chosen centuries ago by royal decree. The buttons weren't just polished. They bore intricate designs that told stories of military campaigns and historical victories. The rifle wasn't just a weapon. It was a piece of living history, maintained and passed down through generations, of soldiers who had sworn the same oath of loyalty, and that enormous bearskin hat wasn't just ceremonial decoration. It was a symbol of something much larger and older than anything Trump had encountered in his political career. It represented traditions that had survived wars, revolutions, and the rise and fall of empires. It connected this young soldier to a chain of duty and honor that stretched back through centuries of British history. For just a moment, Trump felt a flicker of uncertainty. This wasn't like dealing with American military personnel, who served at the pleasure of whoever happened to occupy the White House. This wasn't like negotiating with business partners who wanted something from him, or political opponents who shared the same basic system of government. This was something entirely different, something ancient and immovable that operated according to rules he didn't fully understand. But the moment of doubt passed quickly, replaced by the familiar surge of determination that had carried him through countless challenges before. Rules could be changed, traditions could be updated, and respect, when it wasn't freely given, could always be demanded. The guard would salute him, one way or another. It was simply a matter of finding the right approach. The tension in the courtyard had become thick enough to cut with a knife. Trump was preparing to give his command for the third time when he heard the soft sound of footsteps on gravel approaching from behind. The steps were measured and deliberate, the kind of careful pace that suggested someone was trying to handle a delicate situation without causing alarm. A man in an impeccably tailored dark suit appeared at Trump's shoulder. He was tall and thin, with the kind of precise posture that came from years of diplomatic training. His hair was perfectly combed, his shoes polished to a mirror shine, and his expression carried the practiced calm of someone who had spent decades smoothing over international complications before they could become full-blown incidents. "Mr. President," the man said quietly, his British accent refined and respectful. His voice was pitched low enough that only Trump and perhaps a few nearby staff members could hear him clearly. "If I might have a word?" Trump turned to look at the newcomer, his frustration momentarily redirected. The man's badge identified him as a senior protocol officer from the Foreign and Commonwealth Office, one of those behind-the-scenes professionals who made sure state visits ran smoothly and diplomatic disasters were avoided at all costs. "There seems to be a small misunderstanding," the officer continued, his tone as gentle as if he were explaining something to a curious child rather than correcting the most powerful man in the world. His hands were clasped behind his back in a posture that was both respectful and non-threatening. "Our guardsmen operate under rather specific protocols, you see." Trump's eyes narrowed. He wasn't used to being interrupted, especially not when he was in the middle of establishing his authority. But something in the officer's manner suggested this wasn't going to be a typical conversation about military chain of command or presidential prerogatives. "These soldiers," the protocol officer said, gesturing subtly toward the still motionless guard, "serve Her Majesty the Queen exclusively. Their loyalty, their obedience, their very oath of service, all of it belongs to the Crown alone." He paused for just a moment, allowing the words to settle. "They are not authorized to respond to commands from anyone else, regardless of rank or position." The explanation hit Trump like a splash of cold water. Throughout his presidency, he had grown accustomed to being the ultimate authority figure. In any room he entered, military personnel saluted him because he was their commander-in-chief. Government officials deferred to him because he was their president. Foreign leaders treated him with respect because he represented the most powerful nation on earth. But here, in this ancient courtyard surrounded by centuries of British tradition, those rules simply didn't apply. "I'm afraid these particular guards follow protocols that have remained unchanged for generations," the officer continued, his voice maintaining that same diplomatic smoothness. "They are trained to remain at attention and to acknowledge only specific individuals within the royal hierarchy. It's not a matter of disrespect, Mr. President. It's simply how the system has always worked." Trump felt his face growing warm. This wasn't just embarrassing. It was a fundamental challenge to everything he understood about power and authority. Back home, when he gave an order, people jumped to obey it. When he entered a room, conversations stopped and heads turned. When he spoke, the world listened. But apparently there were places on Earth where even the President of the United States was just another civilian, with no special authority to command respect. The protocol officer seemed to sense Trump's discomfort and continued with practiced diplomatic skill. "These guardsmen have stood their posts during visits from presidents, prime ministers, emperors, and kings from around the world. They maintain the same steadfast position regardless of who approaches them. It's actually considered quite an honor, a demonstration of the unwavering loyalty and discipline that has protected the monarchy for centuries." Behind Trump, his staff had begun to gather closer, drawn by the quiet conversation, but trying to remain at a respectful distance. American diplomats were nodding slightly as they listened to the explanation, finally understanding why their carefully planned arrival ceremony had hit this unexpected snag. Secret Service agents relaxed slightly, realizing this was a cultural misunderstanding rather than a security threat. The British officials, meanwhile, seemed relieved that someone had finally stepped in to explain the situation. They had probably been watching the standoff with growing concern, wondering how long it might continue and whether it would escalate into something more serious. State visits were delicate affairs, and even small misunderstandings could sometimes snowball into major diplomatic problems. "You see," the protocol officer added, "these guards are rather like living monuments to British military tradition. They represent something larger than any individual soldier. They embody the continuity of the Crown itself. Their refusal to break protocol isn't personal, it's institutional." Trump looked back at the guard, who continued to stand in exactly the same position he had maintained throughout the entire encounter. The soldier's face remained expressionless, his eyes still focused on that distant point beyond the palace walls. He gave no sign that he had heard any of the conversation taking place just feet away from him, no indication that he was even aware of the diplomatic crisis his stillness had created. For a moment, Trump found himself genuinely impressed, despite his frustration. The guard's discipline was extraordinary, almost superhuman in its completeness. Here was a young man who had been trained so thoroughly, so completely, that he could ignore the most powerful person in the world standing directly in front of him and demanding his attention. It was a level of self-control and dedication that Trump, despite his annoyance, had to admit was remarkable. "These traditions," the protocol officer continued, "date back hundreds of years. They've survived world wars, revolutions, and massive social changes. The guards who stand here today follow exactly the same protocols as their predecessors who protected kings and queens centuries ago. It's quite extraordinary, really. A direct link to living history." The officer's words began to paint a different picture of what Trump had initially seen as simple disrespect. This wasn't about one soldier refusing to acknowledge him. This was about an entire system of loyalty and duty that operated according to principles older than the United States itself. The Guard wasn't ignoring Trump personally. He was following orders that had been passed down through generations of British soldiers, orders that transcended any individual personality or political office. "I hope you can understand, Mr. President," the protocol officer concluded, "that this is simply how these particular ceremonies work. The Guards serve the Crown, and only the Crown. It's nothing personal, I assure you." Trump felt the weight of dozens of eyes watching him, waiting to see how he would respond to this explanation. Camera crews were still recording, journalists were still taking notes, and diplomatic officials from both countries were still observing every detail of his reaction. This moment would be remembered and analyzed, discussed in newspapers, and debated on television shows around the world. The president realized he was standing at a crossroads. He could continue to insist on acknowledgement that would never come, potentially turning this minor cultural misunderstanding into a major international incident. Or he could accept that some things in this world operated according to rules that even his office couldn't change. Trump stood there in silence for what felt like the longest 30 seconds of his presidency. The protocol officer's words echoed in his mind, each explanation hitting him like a small hammer blow against his understanding of how the world was supposed to work. His jaw worked silently as he processed the reality of what he had just been told. For the first time in years, Donald Trump had encountered something that couldn't be bought, negotiated with, or commanded into submission. The Royal Guard represented something entirely outside his experience, a form of loyalty so absolute and ancient that it made his own presidential authority look temporary and fragile by comparison. The color in Trump's face had deepened from pink to a darker shade of red, and those closest to him could see the internal struggle playing out across his features. His hands clenched and unclenched at his sides as he fought between his instinct to double down and demand respect, and the growing realization that he was fighting a battle he could never win. Around the courtyard, the watching crowd held its collective breath. British officials maintained their diplomatic expressions, but their eyes showed the strain of waiting to see whether this cultural collision would escalate or fade away. American staff members shifted nervously, some checking their phones, others glancing toward the palace entrance as if hoping someone would appear to rescue them from this awkward standoff. The Guard himself remained completely oblivious to the drama he had inadvertently created. His training was so thorough, so deeply ingrained, that the conversations happening around him might as well have been taking place on another planet. His breathing remained steady and controlled. His rifle stayed positioned at the exact same angle. His eyes continued to focus on that invisible point in the distance that only he could see. Camera crews captured every second of Trump's internal debate, their lenses zooming in to catch the subtle changes in his expression as pride warred with pragmatism. This footage would be analyzed frame by political commentators and body language experts for years to come, dissected and debated as evidence of everything from presidential temperament to international relations. Finally, after what seemed like an eternity, Trump's shoulders relaxed slightly. The tension that had been building in his posture for the past several minutes began to ease as he made his decision. He took a small step backward, creating a bit more space between himself and the immovable Guard, and for the first time since this encounter began, his expression showed something other than frustration or confusion. It was the look of a man who had just learned something unexpected about himself and the world around him. Trump turned toward the protocol officer, his business instincts kicking in to help him salvage what he could from this situation. Throughout his career, he had faced plenty of setbacks and surprises, and he had learned that the key to handling them was to adapt quickly and move forward with confidence, even when things didn't go according to plan. "Well," Trump said, his voice carrying just a hint of the diplomatic tone he had learned to use during particularly delicate international negotiations, "I suppose every country has its own way of doing things." The words were simple, but they carried enormous weight in the context of what had just happened. With that single sentence, Trump was acknowledging that there were limits to his authority, boundaries to his power that he couldn't simply bulldoze through with determination and force of personality. The protocol officer's relief was almost visible as he nodded respectfully. Indeed, Mr. President. The diversity of traditions around the world is quite remarkable, isn't it? Trump managed something that might have been a smile, though it looked more like the expression of someone who had just bitten into something. Unexpectedly sour. It certainly is, he replied, glancing one more time at the still motionless guard before turning toward the palace entrance. As the presidential party finally began moving again, the tension in the courtyard started to dissipate, like steam from a cooling kettle. British officials exchanged subtle glances of relief, while American diplomats quietly exhaled and began mentally rewriting their reports about how the arrival ceremony had gone. But the guard remained exactly where he had been throughout the entire encounter. He didn't acknowledge Trump's departure any more than he had acknowledged his arrival. His duty was to stand his post and protect the crown, and presidential frustrations were simply irrelevant to that mission. As far as he was concerned, the past 10 minutes might never have happened at all. Trump walked toward the palace with measured steps, his mind racing as he tried to process what had just occurred. Throughout his life, he had prided himself on being able to handle any situation, to find a way to come out on top no matter what obstacles he faced. He had built an empire, won a presidency, and commanded the respect of world leaders through sheer force of will and strategic thinking. But this young British soldier had just taught him something that no business deal or political campaign ever could have. There were things in this world that existed completely outside the realm of his influence, traditions and loyalties that had been forged over centuries and couldn't be changed by even the most powerful office on earth. As they approached the palace steps, Trump found himself thinking about the guard's unwavering discipline and dedication. Part of him was still frustrated by the encounter, still stung by the public reminder that his authority had limits. But another part of him, the part that had always admired strength and determination in others, couldn't help but respect what he had just witnessed. The soldier had shown a level of commitment and professionalism that Trump recognized, even if he didn't fully understand it. In a world where loyalty was often bought and sold, where allegiances shifted with political wins and personal advantage, there was something almost admirable about someone who stood firm in their duty, regardless of outside pressure. Behind them, the guard continued his silent vigil, unaware that he had just become part of a story that would be told and retold in diplomatic circles for years to come. He had done nothing more than follow his training and honor his oath. But in doing so, he had delivered one of the most profound lessons in institutional power and traditional authority that any American president had ever received. The encounter was over, but its effects would linger long after Trump had left Buckingham Palace and returned to Washington. For the rest of his presidency, whenever he gave orders or expected immediate compliance, somewhere in the back of his mind would be the memory of a young British soldier who had shown him that some things in this world remained beyond any one person's control, no matter how accustomed they were to getting their way. The lesson was simple but profound. True authority isn't just about the power to command. It's about understanding when and where that power has meaning, and recognizing when you're standing in the presence of something larger and older than yourself,